Morning to you all. Happy Hump Day. David, thanks again for putting this together as well in the background. The IT stuff, it's never easy. But moving forward, I'm delighted to be here with you this morning on behalf of the association to basically share with you this webinar on psychological health and safety resources. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us, this morning. We know you're extremely busy, and some of the information that we'll be presenting is very exciting. I think that you'll really enjoy it. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Semiahmoo and Kwantlen First Nations, including the Coast Salish peoples. We would like to acknowledge the lands and the territories of the First Nations that you are all calling in from today for this webinar. And just sort of some basic outlines with respect to this presentation. It is being recorded for reference purposes so that it's made available for the sector in the future. It is an hour-long presentation, and so there'll be no breaks. There'll be an opportunities to raise questions in the chat for the speaker. Both Dave and I will navigate through that and bring it to Aaron's attention. But most likely the questions will be answered at the end of the session. Now, just as you are aware, there will be a little survey at the end of the session. And so when you close the window, it'll pop up. And so please make sure that you respond to that survey. It helps us tremendously in improving future training sessions and also becoming aware of like what is important to you at this point in time in the wonderful world of health and safety. And so, we will be posting the information. Aaron's PowerPoint, so please, you don't need to frantically write everything down, but it will be there for you. And also the recording of this webinar too. We're working on putting all these webinars together for the sector in the future as well. And now, I think mental health is a real important topic. It always has been pre-pandemic. I think the pandemic has really highlighted the need to, provide and access very important resources that are desperately needed. And so I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Erin Secker from the Canadian Mental Health Association. She's the Education and Training Director at the Canadian Mental Health Association, who has many years of experience as an educator. And she effectively collaborates with workplaces by fostering psychological safety and health environments for their staff and clients. And she holds a master's degree in education and is also a chartered professional in human resources. And what's really cool about having Erin back is she was one of the co-presenters at the Associations of the Council at the time webinar on psychological health and safety in the workplace with Johnny Morris last June. And so I'm really excited that you're here today to share with us all the great things that I've been working in the background and seeing a lot of this stuff come together with respect to getting some really much needed tools and resources for our sector. Erin, welcome and thank you.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Sat. It's really great to be here and to be invited back. I saw we've got really great attendance on this session today, so I'm very pleased to see that this is an important topic for folks. And so before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the current and unceded lands of the Okanagan Syilx people, the Okanagan Syilx Nation. And again, very grateful to be here. I actually was in transit just this morning, flew in, and always grateful when that plane lands in the runway nice and safely, and very happy to be now also joining you virtually. So thank you so much for having me. And I have the pleasure today to talk about psychological health and safety in the workplace. I'm going to be able to kind of bring everybody onto the same page. Some folks are very familiar with this topic. For others, it's still very new. So we'll go over some of those terms to make sure that we have a good understanding of what it means when I say psychological health and when I say psychological safety. We'll put that into the perspective of the workplace. So we'll discuss a little bit about what the workplace role is for employees and employers. And then the last half of my presentation is really going to introduce you to a free training program that we have available for the community social services sector. And so I'm going to provide a little bit of an orientation around how you can access that training program and the different levels of that training program that are available at the moment. And so when I was speaking to many folks back in June, I was able to introduce you to our BC's Hub for Workplace Mental Health and let you know that that training program was essentially forthcoming at the time. And now all 3 levels are launched. So I'm going to help you get comfy cozy with that idea. Maybe you can see if it's a good fit for you, your team, or your broader workplace as well. And so I'm going to just share my slides here, my PowerPoint. Perfect. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A in the WebEx. Additionally, there is a chat function, so please feel free to put any comments, thoughts in the chat. And I have a couple questions for you as well that hopefully you can share some of your thoughts and experiences with. Great.
Aaron, I just want you to know we can see your screen, so thank you.
Perfect, thank you. I love the thumbs up. Thanks. So as I said, we're going to start with what psychological health and safety actually means. And you'll see this term in that order almost every time, psychological health and safety. Similarly, when we talk about occupational health and safety, we're talking about health and safety councils and health and safety committees. And so you're probably very familiar with the term. There's a lot of similarities to when we're talking about physical health and safety. So I'm going to try and make some of those parallels for you and draw on those things that are familiar. However, at the same time, as I go through this presentation, you're going to hear me talk about safety first very frequently, like over and over again, safety first. So even though we say health and safety, I'm going to really try to hammer home the idea that we actually need safety to help promote health. Right, so the safety part actually comes first. The safety part is what we need to prioritize to help build the health. So even though we have health and safety, if you can try to start thinking in your brain safety and health, I think that that maybe is a little bit of a shift in our understanding as far as how it goes in the workplace. And so just a couple quick definitions. These are ones that I like. They're not the only definitions. You probably have some of your own that you enjoy or different ways that you've explained this to other folks. But these are the ones that kind of stand out to me or land well for me. And so when we talk about psychological health or essentially mental health, it's a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. And so I've highlighted some of those words there. The highlighting, the bold is mine, but I think this idea of potential and coping and contribution are very important. And so everyone's potential, that's really up to them. You know, what are my hopes? What are my dreams? What do I want to accomplish? That's very individual and very subjective. And so it should be up to that person to decide what that potential looks like for them and what they want, right? And this is to help make sure that they have the ability to do this more often than not. And similarly, coping with the normal stresses of life. So this isn't about everything is perfect, sunshine and rainbows. This is understanding that there are normal stresses in our life. And so how do we make sure that we can kind of ride those waves of change, right? We know that change is a constant in life. So how do we have that optimism, that confidence to go through life? And part of this, of course, is around our own support networks. So this isn't just about bootstrapping or our own individual skills. This is also about those support networks that we have around us. And then a contribution to our community. And so we know that we don't necessarily need to be the best at everything or the only person who can do something, but we know that we bring something to the table, right? We bring something to our family or our social groups, and then of course, in this case, to our workplaces and to our teams. And that again can be a very social and collaborative perspective. It doesn't have to mean that we're the only person or the best person all the time. And then when I talk about psychological safety, this is from Guarding Minds at Work, which is a resource that you find out more information about through our workmentalhealthbc.ca, our workplace mental health hub, a really great website that talks about the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, and also provides a free survey tool that you could implement in your own workplace. So their definition of psychological safety, and this is a fairly common one, is that it deals with the risk of injury to psychological well-being. And improving psychological safety in a work setting involves taking precautions to avert injury or danger to employee psychological health that is within the influence and responsibility of an employer. So similarly, when we talk about occupational health and safety in the workplace, when we're thinking about physical safety, we're still trying to be within reason, right? So this is still while, coming to work in the presence at the workplace. For some people who are working from home, of course, that does extend to your home office, making sure that you have still very safe working alone procedures. You've probably had to do a checklist around whether your computer is plugged into, like a breaker bar versus a direct outlet. So of course we have some familiarity with the role of health and safety, even in our own homes, if we're working from homes. And again, this will extend to our psychological health and safety as well. But taking precautions to avert injury or danger. Some of this language, again, might sound very familiar to you. And what we're really talking about here is being able to identify hazards to our psychological health. So what are some of those things that might show up in the workplace or take place in the workplace that could have a detrimental effect on that ability to cope, right? That ability to cope with the normal stresses of life. What are some of those hazards that could happen in the workplace that keep us from feeling like we have that optimism or we have that confidence, that make us feel like we're not making a contribution to the workplace, right? That make it seem like we don't bring anything to the table. And so this is about trying to identify what are some of those hazards that can happen at work, whether they are kind of social, physical, whether this is kind of manager to employee or employee to employee or client and patient with employee. So looking at all of these different sorts of hazards that really keep us from being our best selves in the workplace more often than not, that keep us from feeling like we can take those interpersonal risks, right? That we can raise our hand with a new idea. So what are those sorts of hazards that can get in the way? And so this is what the first part of my presentation is really going to be looking at, is how do we identify some of those hazards in our sector? And then we'll start to talk about how we can address some of them, which will go into that training program. So recognizing that our care training program is one of the ways that we can start to make sure that people are equipped to identify those hazards, recognize their own role in hazards, right? So how do we show up and how does that affect others, dependent on the different role that we have? And then also, again, how do we then work to build a healthy culture? Because it's not just about individual action. Individual action is part of it, but also things like our policies and our procedures. And so just a reminder once again that psychological safety contributes to psychological health. So we're really talking about building a foundation of psychological safety, and then doing so through that identification of hazards, hopefully in a very collaborative approach, not just a top-down approach. And then to recognize how we can start to make sure that we're putting those safeguards in place. Many folks here are probably familiar with that kind of inverted triangle when we talk about physical workplace hazards. When we talk about kind of the level of effectiveness. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can find it very easily on WorkSafe. But that inverted triangle of effectiveness as far as things like personal protective equipment being kind of at the base. And then we talk slowly but surely about actually going all the way to removing those hazards and promoting health. And it's the same thing here when we're talking about psychological safety and health. So in some cases, there are certain hazards that are part of the job that likely will never be removed, right? There are certain things that might actually just be part of the job. And then we can need to look at what do we put in place to help people, whether that's critical incident debriefing, whether that is peer support in the workplace. And then also looking at what are some of the hazards in the workplace that maybe don't have to be there, that maybe we've actually just come to accept. But if we were actually critically engaged, right, if we had more supports or if we had different budget, how would we actually maybe address some of those things that we've just come to accept? And then, as I said, moving up even better to looking about not just kind of like stop gaps and not just small changes, but also maybe even potentially pretty large overhauls to our workplace culture. And thank you, Sat, for putting in that chat. Absolutely, the hierarchy of controls is exactly what I'm talking about. And some of it, some of it's very clearly directly makes that connection to psychological health and safety. Some of it you have to maybe think on a little bit further, but that hierarchy of controls actually is very similar here. And so when we talk about those hazards, some probably immediately come to your mind, right? There are probably some very significant issues or significant situations that you've even maybe been through, or your colleagues have been through. And some of those, again, we often are I would say in general, better at addressing those obvious ones, because we know when something has happened that just is not right. We know when somebody is obviously shaken up at work or having a hard time processing what's happened. Some things, of course, like the pandemic, although the pandemic itself is a very obvious cause of stress, there's all sorts of little tendrils related to that, where there could actually be some cumulative stresses, right, or some cumulative challenges that are not as obvious at first glance. And there's also, again, there's some things that we know will have an effect on nearly anybody who are to encounter those hazards. But there can also be some where, again, it's somewhat subjective, right? It can be a little bit more difficult. So how one person experienced a certain interaction with a patient and how someone else experienced it might be very different, right? It doesn't mean, that we don't have to address it just because someone said, oh, I was fine in the moment. It still may be something that we need to address. And so this is why I really try to emphasize, again, that collaborative approach. So something that is obvious to someone may not be obvious to you and vice versa. And it doesn't mean that we don't need to address it. And so those cumulative stressors are also very important. And I think those are some of the ones that are coming to the forefront right now. Some of those kind of day in and day out things that we're experiencing. When I started in this work, working in mental health and community mental health and then workplace mental health, we talked a lot about kind of individual coping strategies. We talked a lot about resilience. And I've seen some changes in those conversations. Like there's definitely a increased focus now on our workplace culture, the role of the entire workplace and not just individual skills, which I think is a very positive movement. But I still find that, we were talking about resilience before, and then unfortunately now a lot of the conversation has shifted to burnout, which really is part of that same spectrum where we're still talking about some of these cumulative stressors that are happening at work that are contributing to burnout, which really does highlight that we have still a long way to go in addressing these hazards at work. And so what I'd like to do is just turn this question to you. So before I provide some examples of hazards at work, you do have a chat function in WebEx, and I would love for you to take a moment and brainstorm a little bit. What are some of the hazards that you are aware of? And in particular, I am talking about psychological safety hazards. However, of course, if we don't feel physically safe at work, that's going to have an impact on our psychological health as well. But what are some of the hazards you might be aware of related to psychological safety? And if you have some ideas, feel free to put them in the chat. I would ask that you don't have any identifying information. So you don't need to say, yesterday at workplace ABC, this happened. I don't need that level of detail, but I think there's probably quite a few hazards that might be coming to mind at this point. So those things that keep you from being your best self at work, that contribute to burnout, that maybe sometimes make you feel like you're not contributing in the ways that you would like to. We've heard a lot about things like even moral injury over the last couple of years, where you feel like your values are even being challenged at work, right? Maybe there's a level of care that you expect and you're not seeing it for whatever reason. And so any of those examples you can think of in the chat, I would love for a little bit of that brainstorm. I see that there might be, there we go, I'm opening the chat up. So if you're able to, and if you make sure that you choose for everyone, some of those hazards you're aware of in the community social services sector. And then in particular, is there anything unique to this line of work, right? Or the line of work that we do in our sector? So I work with workplaces of all different sizes, all different sectors. When we talk about our hub for workplace mental health, another priority sector is hospitality and tourism. And so there are some common hazards that I'm going to highlight in a moment that kind of thread through all sorts of different industries and sectors. But there are some that I do think either stand out in particular or maybe are unique to community social services. So it's going to give you a moment, and you can put it again in the chat to everyone or to all panelists. Either way, then I will see them and I can read them out. So some of the ones that are coming in, physical and verbal behaviors, so violence even towards staff. Oh, here's a whole bunch in here now. Lack of applicants for vacancies, so staff being overworked, absolutely, so understaffing and overwork. Staff shortages requiring overtime. Taking on the stress of clients, absolutely. Verbal aggression and threats. Poor client and staff boundaries. Oh, I'm seeing lots about boundaries here. Support from supervisors to their staff. Not enough hours in the day. Compassion fatigue are some of the examples. Higher client needs than in the past is another example. And I'll give you just another moment here if there's anything else you're thinking of. A lot of these are the ones that came to my mind too. So that kind of staffing crisis, absolutely. And we can talk about how that has, again, a spillover effect, right? When we have a culture where we've been understaffed for quite some time. And when it comes to those boundaries as well, that's constantly difficult, right? Having to set and maintain those boundaries, communicate them appropriately. And most of us, I think it's fair to say, most, if not all of us, have come to these jobs because we care, right? We're in the community social services because we care about people. We care about our work. Our work has value to us beyond the paycheck. And of course, when that's the case, when we have these values and when we care so deeply for folks, maintaining those boundaries does become very difficult. It becomes even more important, but it becomes even more difficult as well. And then, of course, we compound that with understanding or understaffing, sorry, after understaffing. We combine it with understaffing, we combine it with that overtime, that feeling tired. And of course, we can understand why that again snowballs. It just builds up and makes it even harder to set those boundaries if you feel like people are not going to get that care. And I see behavior changes with individuals not able to balance out paperwork, with hands-on individuals. So that admin versus frontline work I'm seeing in the chat as well. Having people feel like they can come to me. Yeah, so wanting to have that open door policy for staff, but also knowing you need those boundaries around your administrative time, right? Or around the time for your other duties. So I'm seeing that about balance in the chat as well. So thank you everyone for those examples. Oh, last one here that I'll read, and there might be some others after. Shift work. Yeah, so balancing shift work, night shifts, and still having to balance with your personal life. Absolutely. So thanks for those examples, everyone. And these are some of the ones that I had highlighted ahead as well. And I think we pretty much got there in the chat. So if we think about client support or patient care, and I know we have a very diverse sector, so everyone in this meeting has probably very different jobs. But in our sector in particular, when we talk about client support or patient care, we've got to deal with lots of different interpersonal situations, right? The level of communication skills that we need in this sector tend to be incredibly high. The empathy that we need to have incredibly high. And again, that ties into those boundaries that we need to have as well. And so being able to also meet sometimes that difficult behavior or challenging behavior when you know someone's needs are not being met or not being met in a way that's acceptable to them. How do we navigate those while maintaining that empathy while also not burning ourselves out? We also have a lot of high stakes decision making because we often have people who are relying on us, right? Whether they're relying on us, again, for health and well-being, for learning needs, for finding their way through a new community, for housing, right? Of course, that's very high stakes as well. The market right now for absolutely anyone, rentals, very difficult. And so how to navigate community resources, just a few of the many different things that we might be doing in our jobs. And this is high stakes for people's lives, right? Real impact, very immediate impact in many cases. And so that's a lot of pressure. And I think sometimes we can take that pressure for granted in our jobs because it's just, part of the job. But I just really want to highlight that and acknowledge it and honor how much high stakes decision making there is in most of our jobs. And if you're a line manager, a people manager, right, there's people's jobs and people's day-to-day, 8 to 10 plus hours that you are there and contributing to, right? And so very high stakes, very important work that we're doing. And of course, we're seeing very high levels of fatigue, people feeling overwhelmed, people feeling burnt out. And of course, that can create a bit of a cycle, as someone had said in the chat, if we've got that understaffing, if we've got people who are taking more sick time or short-term leave or long-term leave because of these unaddressed or needing to address our psychological or physical health needs, that just can contribute even more for the folks who are still on the front line or still providing services. And what I've heard a lot from this sector, and this is my sector too, is that we then start to hear a lot about like guilt and shame and people who really actually need that time off. They need to turn down an extra shift or they need to take their sick days. They need to take their vacations even, and hearing that they really don't feel like they can do that, right? Because their clients need them or their patients need them, their colleagues need them. And that really overwhelming pressure to show up and to be there, even though we're feeling that we're burning out. We know that we don't have much left to give, but those feelings of guilt and shame that we can't take that time. And it creates like really quite a high, a pressure cooker, I think, of a workplace culture. And a lot of us are in this right now. And I think that's showing up. And when we think about just even the attendance in this session, right, this is a hot topic. Some other common hazards, and I see these across sectors. I think, again, they're very, very prominent in this sector in community social services, but I see them in others as well. A big one that's been going on for quite a long time is around a lack of manager training. So a lot of the times people get promoted into a supervisor, team leader, or manager position because they're really good at the jobs that they started with, or they're just very dependable. They have some of those interpersonal skills, whatever the case may be, right? The time on the job. And then we sometimes just forget, or we don't highlight the fact that now when you are leading people or you're formally leading people, there's a whole host of additional skills that come with that, right? And so sometimes we don't take the time to actually teach those skills. And I highlight this now in particular because, as we just talked about, if we're understaffed, if we're having a hard time getting people in the role, we need to get them onboarded as fast as possible. I think, again, we're really kind of speeding through a lot of the onboarding and orientation and upskilling and professional development needs of our workforce right now. So, for a long time, we called those soft skills. I don't think that does them justice. Again, those interpersonal skills that we need to take the time to make sure that there is that training. And unfortunately, right now, we're finding that very difficult to do in most workplaces. We've already talked about understaffing and volume of work. Right before this webinar started, I was talking to Sat and mentioning how for those of us who are working from home or partially working from home, there's still a volume of work challenge where we tend to see meetings or appointments that are back to back to back to back. Right? I talked to a lot of folks who are doing virtual counseling, and if we really think about that time to do the admin work that we need to do, finding that difficult because we really feel like we can put appointments back to back where we don't even have to get up and walk from one room to another. Also volume of work, whether you're working on premise, right, in a different workplace, or in your own home, either way, we're also seeing a lot of people needing community social services, whether that is related to their mental health needs, their physical health needs, support, connection, around learning needs, navigation, as I've mentioned, housing. There's just a lot of folks who seem to be needing those supports and those services. We also know that for many, there was a backlog during COVID, right? So that volume of work, I think, is also very real and exacerbated by some of those changes in boundaries, whether those are physical boundaries or time boundaries that we used to have. And something that is also really coming to the forefront here is that if we're creating these pressure cooker environments, these really difficult environments for anyone to stay in, right, for anyone to navigate, and then we think about how we're trying really desperately to get new employees into these workplaces, well, they're already entering, in many cases, unsafe and unhealthy cultures. And that's not because of any one person's fault or any one person's personality or anything like that. It's really about not necessarily having the time to support folks. Or if you come into an environment and people are feeling very down or very blue or very critical of the sector or of that specific workplace or the patients or clients that you have, it's really hard for new people to come in and stay optimistic, right? Or just to feel, again, if we think back to the definition of mental health, that optimism, that ability to cope, right? A lot of the times it's going to feel like I don't actually have that available to me for whatever reason, because people are busy or because they're feeling drained. Asking for help and taking that time for myself is already going to be very difficult. And so unfortunately, we're seeing in many cases kind of a revolving door of hiring and people leaving. Right, it seems to be really difficult to interrupt that cycle. And I do think a big part of it is around this unsafe and unhealthy cultures that they're entering. Similarly, when we look at short-term and long-term disability leave, and if we think about those related to mental health or psychological health, where we see the biggest return on investment for kind of interventions essentially is on things like stay at work policies, right? Stay at work supports, return to work policies and return to work supports, as well as leadership training. And those are some of the areas that we see the biggest return on investment. And I think it really is because that can help to address this idea of the unhealthy culture. So people maybe leave, they leave or they take that break that they need to be well. But if they come right back from that leave into an unhealthy culture, it's not going to take very long for people to kind of burn out again or to experience a crisis again. So we really need to highlight this culture piece. And another way to look at it is that if we have an unsafe work culture, it's actually going to undermine any initiative you take towards health promotion. And so I know a lot of workplaces where they'll invest in and very good things like team building time. We think about staff barbecues, lunch and learns, all sorts of really great initiatives. But those initiatives on their own, if we're not addressing our safety and our work culture, unfortunately, again, that return on investment on those is not going to be very high. I'm not saying that they're not worth doing, but those alone, without an emphasis on our culture, is going to be, in the grand scheme of things, wasting some money, wasting some time if we're not also addressing those bigger cultural pieces, our policies and our procedures as well. And so I'm not saying to stop doing those things, right? Education through lunch and learns, professional development, team building, trying to boost morale, all of those things are very, very good to do. But we also need to look at our day in and day out work culture, because only having one-offs or those short events and not addressing the broader picture, unfortunately, is going to not get us what we're probably hoping to see in the workplace. And another way to look at this for those folks who are visual, I'm always inspired by all of the driving up and down the Okanagan Valley that I do. So this reminds me a lot of Highway 3, the Crow's Nest Highway, for anyone who's familiar. But you can kind of think of this, it's kind of linear. It's not actually linear in real life, but one way to look at it is if we've got our current state over there on the one side, we've got improved psychological safety there in the middle. That's one of our destinations. And our bigger destination that we're really trying to get to is improved psychological health and safety. And I have these little orange cones representing the hazards in our workplace. And so if we kind of take a step back and look at our current state, we might actually identify that there's a lot of hazards to our psychological health between our current state and being able to improve that, right? Between trying to get to an improved state in our workplace. And I just want to acknowledge that if we get to this idea of improved psychological health and safety, notice that the hazards haven't disappeared, right? There's fewer of them, but they haven't disappeared. So I really like this as just a visual to think about the fact that it's a continual journey, right? It's actually, it just keeps on going, but also that our hazards will not necessarily completely disappear. As I said, some of them are actually ingrained in our jobs, ingrained in those interpersonal connections and experiences that we might have, ingrained into, maybe if I'm sitting all day, there's some physical hazards there. Or I'm standing all day, there's different physical hazards there. So I'm not saying that they all disappear, but we're bringing them to the forefront. We're trying to recognize them, put a name to them, and then we're addressing them as we go, right? We're trying to still, again, minimize them, have some control over what those hazards are. So I've made them a little bit smaller on the right-hand side, a little bit more sparse, but they haven't actually disappeared. And if you think of this as a road that goes on and on and on, we're continually trying to improve psychological health and safety. Again, those hazards are not going to completely disappear, right? But we've highlighted them, we've become aware of them, and we'll address them as we go along. And so I talked a little bit already about some of those cumulative hazards that we might have in the workplace, or some of the different stressors that we have. And I've talked a little bit now also about the idea of needing to address our culture, right? Making sure that we have a positive health promoting culture. And some of the things that I hear that are, I don't like to say red flags, but definitely some things that I hear that make me stop and pause. There can be like these little these little kind of invitations to maybe stop and talk about our culture a little bit. And some things that are pretty common, and these are just some examples that I've heard in the last little while, that highlight to me there could be some changes or some discussions to be had. When we hear things like, this is just the way we do things here. So for example, we're onboarding a new employee, right? Or somebody is moved into a different position or a different department. And we just say, well, that's just the way we do things here. So they say, why? They want an explanation, or maybe they've got a new idea, but we shut that down, right? Is this because we don't have time to discuss it? We don't want to discuss it? Are we defensive about those new ideas? Things like this, like just the way we do things here, that to me would be something that would make me stop and pause for a moment. Or I hear things like, oh, she's always like that, or he's like that, or they're like that. Oh, she's always like that. Like, well, are we potentially dismissing, maybe it's not even bullying and harassment, but are we maybe dismissing um, uh, examples of someone not being very respectful in the workplace, right? Are we accepting disrespect in the workplace and writing it off? Again, instead of stopping and saying, okay, again, maybe there's some communication strategies here that we need to highlight, or maybe a tough conversation does need to be had, right, around how people are being treated in the workplace. Another one, burning the midnight oil, right, or if we're just talking about celebrating people who are the first to show up and the last to leave, celebrating people going over and above, over and over and over again. I understand why that is and kind of how that comes about in the workplace, but really watching for that, right? We are going to see more of what we celebrate, what we encourage, and what we reward in the workplace. And so if we're trying to say, on the one hand, set boundaries, take that time for yourself, take your days off, say no to a shift if you have the option, you've got too many on your plate, make sure that you take that time. But at the other side of our mouth, we're completely praising and celebrating those folks who don't draw those boundaries. Well, at the end of the day, right, what are we actually going to see more of, right? We're not going to actually see more of what we just tell people they should do. We're going to see what we're rewarding and encouraging. And sometimes this happens very implicitly or even accidentally. Right? Sometimes this happens without us even realizing it. So that's why I'm highlighting these examples here. Another one I've heard recently, just celebrating that staff had put in countless unpaid hours for something related to a client service. And again, I understand why we celebrate these. Like, we care so much about our jobs, and we want to make sure that any of our clients or our patients or customers are folks that are getting what they need, and we want to make sure that we're facilitating what they need. But sometimes there are those challenges in the system, right, when it comes to being underpaid, right, or the funding for a project. And unfortunately, sometimes the staff and volunteers bear the burden of that. And again, we celebrate it instead of saying, hey, this is actually not okay, right? And this is part of why we're burning people out, right? Or why we have that revolving door. So once again, just noticing what it is that we're celebrating, and trying to make sure that we're highlighting those things and challenging some of these other things that might be coming up. Some of the other signs that we have psychological safety in the workplace, so kind of doing a shift towards, okay, those are some of the challenges, those implicit things that we might hear that tell us things are unsafe, right, or less safe, right, less health promoting. We shift into a different gear here and we talk about the things that might show up if we have some safety, right? So how do we know that we actually are making some good strides in this area? And I just want to stop again and recognize that workplaces are all on a journey for this. So there's guaranteed to be some hazards in every workplace, just as there's guaranteed to be some positives in every workplace, those health promoters in every workplace. But if we're making good strides in psychological safety, right, building up a culture of safety, we'll see more of, generally speaking, we'll see more of people actually speaking up. Again, if we are defensive, we might feel like, oh, we're being challenged. But actually people feeling comfortable and safe to speak up is a really good sign. Of course, doing so, through the proper channels, doing so appropriately. But if people are not doing that, right, maybe that means that we actually need to clarify what that process is. So people speaking up can actually be a very strong sign of having team safety and that psychological safe culture. Interpersonal risk taking, so people are willing to say, hey, this is important, or hey, maybe there is a different way to do this. Have we thought about this other thing? Even standing up for what they believe is right. We also see higher levels of troubleshooting and creativity as well. And this makes a lot of sense to me, right? If you feel safe and secure in your job, right, that you're not going to be penalized for trying to suggest things or to think about things differently, to look for opportunity, it's a lot easier to be creative, right, and to problem solve. And I like to say a lot for people who are in supervisor, team leader, or manager positions. If you feel like you're running around all the time, putting out those fires, right? If you're the one that needs to be the stopgap for every single thing, we maybe need to look at how have we empowered our teams, right? Or have we empowered our teams? If we're not seeing creativity, if we're not seeing people kind of stepping up or taking ownership, maybe we've done a lot to actually disempower, again, often accidentally, but disempower people, right, to keep them from being able to speak up. So we might want to just, again, have that as a bit of a sign in our mind that something there could shift. Some other signs of safety, higher levels of morale. And again, I'm not saying that things are perfect. There are still real larger systemic and structural challenges. So I'm not saying everyone says, this is fine every day, day in and day out for every situation. But generally speaking, we'd see higher morale. We also see people are faster to give someone the benefit of the doubt, right? So if someone says something or does something that I don't like, right, or that I feel like maybe I want to take personally, in safe environments, we see that folks are more fast to either, ask about it, right? Actually just have a direct conversation and say, what did you mean by that? Right? Or could you tell me what you were thinking when you said that? Or to just say, hey, that actually hurt my feelings, right? Or I'm not sure I appreciated that comment. People more likely to actually address those things or give that benefit of the doubt that, maybe it actually wasn't a personal attack. Maybe it wasn't actually a slight. right? So a little bit more of that. Um, Similarly to a bit more trust in leadership and trust in colleagues. So if mistakes are made, a little bit more trust that people are actually doing the best that they can in that situation, more willingness to be able to see challenges as learning opportunities, again, rather than a personal attack or a failure. So again, we can just start to see how that impacts culture positively. And then better able to manage change, which I think is incredibly important. And even if it was the only benefit that we would see from psychological safety, I think it would be worthwhile, because we know that change is constant, but we're able to bounce back not only as individuals, because we have that psychological health, that ability to cope, but also better able to manage change as a team and as a department and as a broader workplace, right? We're able to kind of band together, collaborate together, because one little problem or one little challenge isn't enough to kind of spiral everybody as far as pointing fingers and blame, right? Or people feeling ashamed and not wanting to mention mistakes. So all of these things are going to start to help to contribute to being able to manage change a little bit more positively. It doesn't mean that people never struggle, doesn't mean that they don't have questions. If anything, though, it means that they're better able to say, I foresee struggling with this, right? I have the safety to be able to say, I think I might need a hand with this change, right? Or I might need some support learning that skill. Or I could see that this could be a difficulty and I'm going to need more time. But people feel more safe to be able to actually do that and to say that, rather than just kind of white knuckling it through the day and hoping that nobody notices that they're struggling. So when we talk about building safety, kind of shifting gears here into a kind of problem solving and positive approach. So we talked a lot about hazards and unsafe environments, shifting into what we'll see if we have safety, but how do we actually build more of this? There's many different ways to approach it. I like to think of it through these 3 steps. So building awareness and readiness. Presentations like this, I think, can help to contribute to awareness and readiness. If you have a position where you are a leader in the workplace, helping to build that awareness and readiness across your team. If you're a frontline employee and you're hoping to bring this back to maybe senior leaders in your workplace, you may have to kind of manage up essentially and build some awareness and readiness in their perspectives as well as those individual actions, as I said. So we do all have a part to play in the different roles that we have. And individual actions, of course, can just be our day-to-day. Are we stopping and greeting people? Are we stopping and giving them attention when they ask a question instead of getting upset for somebody asking a question? Are we making sure that we're really promoting a civil and respectful workplace? So those individual actions are important, as well as recognizing those boundaries that I can maintain. If I am in a people leader role, I have a lot of impact on people's day-to-day lives through their jobs. So again, how do I stop and make sure that if I say I have an open door policy, I actually mean it? I'm very clear about how I'm reachable. If people again come to me with mistakes, I actually say I work together with them to say, okay, how do we address this? What can we do about this? Instead of being mad at the messenger, right, for telling me about it. Because again, how you act will actually influence the behavior you see in the future. So if you say, I want to know about mistakes so we can address them, but then you do get mad at the messenger, really what's going to happen is that it's not that mistakes are going to stop being made, is that you're not going to be finding out about them in a timely fashion. So making sure, again, that we're kind of being consistent between our words and our actions, being consistent on a day-to-day basis. Those are some of the things that can help to build safety. And then also, as I said, through our policies and procedures and some of those bigger structural changes that we might be able to make in the workplace. And so these are kind of 3 ways to loosely categorize the different things that we can do. This is also kind of in alignment with the CARE program that I had talked about. So we're talking about our Caring and Respectful Employer program, which I said at the top is a free one. And so just moving into that, I'm going to help you to kind of feel like you've got a good orientation to this program, how you can access it. And then so hopefully with some of this awareness and readiness of this webinar, you can then, whether it's immediately after or after lunch break, whatever it might be, maybe you can take a moment and check out our workplace hub for resources as well as that training program. So then you can learn more about those individual actions, policies and procedures, and awareness and readiness building that you can do within your role, or you might want to, kick it up or kick it down to some folks or kick it sideways to some folks who might also be interested. And so just very quickly here, I've got a screenshot from our sector page from the Workplace Mental Health Hub. And this hub, the address is on the bottom of the slide there, workmentalhealthbc.ca, and I think Sada put it in the chat as well. And this is the same website that I had presented about last year. It's got a bit of a color scheme change, a bit of a branding overhaul. But if you go to workmentalhealthbc.ca, the first page you're going to see is going to have you select your sector, and you can pick community social services. We do also have a bubble for folks in kind of community healthcare, long-term care. And so in some cases, you might feel like you can straddle both of those. So in that case, please explore both. That is perfectly fine. And when you go to community social services, this is the page that you're going to see here. And so at the top, I've highlighted that there's a discover button. That's how you can access all sorts of different written and video resources, and we're continually adding to that. So a good place to start for some quick reading. In the middle of the page here, I've also highlighted our workplace care certificate. This is the one that I'm going to go into in more detail in just a moment, that 3-level training program I had mentioned. And then the other one I just want to highlight, and again, I could talk about this one for hours as well, but we also have a confidential peer support chat. And so when this is online, you have online option, text and call option to talk to folks who also work in community social services about pretty much anything that you want. It's not a crisis line, but certainly they are there to listen non-judgmentally and to support you, refer you to other resources, like again, an informal referral if needed. They're very aware of what other resources are out there. But for most people, we're finding you just want to call and chat, and maybe you want to talk about a difficult shift that you had, or you're really actually kind of working yourself up to be able to go to work in the morning and you're having a tough time. All sorts of different reasons why that peer support chat might be of value to you. It is also free to access, so encouraging you to check that out. It's called Care to Speak, and you also might want to share that in your workplace too. But the focus for today is on our workplace care certificate. And as I mentioned, it's a free training program. Everything on the hub here is free to access. We're really grateful for funding from the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions, as well as the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, for helping us to make these resources free and widely available. They'd recognized that the community social services sector is in great need of psychological health and safety support, given all of the different hazards that we talked about earlier on. And this is led by the Canadian Mental Health Association BC division, so that's where I work. And we also have lots of different community partners, one of them being the Federation for Community Social Services of BC. And I'll talk about them more in a moment because they actually have learning coaches available to support you through this care certificate training. And so here's just a high level example or flow through of the training program and what it looks like. So as I said, there are 3 levels to it. I have it here from left to right. You can also think of it as kind of a little bit of a funnel. And so our Care Level 1 course, that is a self-paced course. It actually self-paced 2 courses. It consists of Mental Health 101 as well as Understanding Addictions. And so that is a 2-parter self-paced program. Everyone can enter. It's ongoing registration. So if you go to workmentalhealthbc.ca, go to your community social services sector page, you'll see that bubble that I showed you where you can enroll in level 1 right away. So you could do that right this moment. If you have a second little window open, you could do it after this, but you can enroll in level 1 right now and get started. You have as much time as you need to complete the program. When we first launched it, we had it as more of a cohort model, so we could make sure that we can give people the right level of support that they need through the discussion boards, through the learning coach that I mentioned. But what we found is that we're able to meet the volume pretty well. And so we've been able to just open that registration for everyone. And then, as I said, it's self-paced. You work through it. There's a combination of text and videos and links and different PDF resources for you, as well as the option to go in and ask questions to your peers or contribute to peer discussion. And then, as I said, we have learning coaches available through the Federation of Community Social Services of BC, and they're there to answer questions by email. You can also call them up and say, you know, I have a question about how this pertains to my workplace, or I'm really struggling with this concept, or I'd like to learn more. What are some other resources? And so we have that people-powered support there to help guide you. So we've made it self-paced for convenience and accessibility, but we've made sure that we still have that people support because we don't want you to feel like you're doing this by yourself, right? Or that you're alone. And then with Care Level 1, it's kind of complemented by peer discussion opportunities and then other optional webinars that we try to offer on a regular basis. We move to care level 2. This one is geared in particular for people leaders. So again, team leaders, supervisors, managers, or people who expect to maybe be in those roles at some point and maybe want to do some of that pre-professional development. And so you can go into care level 2. We recommend that you do them sequentially, 1 and then 2 and then 3. So level 2 builds off of level 1 as far as going from that awareness and readiness to understanding your role as a leader, how you can build trust, how you can have caring conversations and tough conversations. A little bit there about the duty to accommodate, duty to inquire. Again, there's additional webinars, roundtables that we're working on, and toolkits. And then when we get to level 3, that's for senior leaders who have some role to play in policy and procedure. And so if you are, maybe doing some HR functions or HR off the side of your desk, even if you are an employer, senior leader, as I had said, or an occupational health and safety committee, perhaps, then level 3 would be applicable for you. That is also, level 2 is self-paced, level 3 is partly self-paced, followed by 2 live virtual classroom dates. And so you basically do a lot of pre-work by yourself in level 3. So taking kind of inventory of how you're doing along the national standard. And then in those virtual classroom dates, you have a small peer group and a facilitator who's helping you kind of bring those concepts alive and to think about those next steps. And then the idea with level 3 is that you leave with a tangible plan for some of those first steps to address some of those hazards and broader cultural pieces around psychological health and safety. And then, as I had said, there's all sorts of different resources available on the hub that complement these themes. And then just really quickly here, I've already kind of talked about what you'll learn about. I'll go through these quickly and make sure we have some time for questions. But as I said, care level 1, that first 2 courses, self-paced, available for everyone. The goals of that are to learn about how mental health fluctuates over time, and then just some brief information about anxiety, depression, disordered eating, and substance use challenges. And that is 100% right. You'll have a chance to review this in more time afterwards. And then also to make sure that you have some skills around reducing stigma, starting positive conversations, as well as being able to better recognize and address chronic stress and burnout for your own well-being. So this is, again, about awareness, readiness, and a lot about self-care as well. And then as we move into level 2, it's that recognizing your role as a people leader. And so identifying your role in promoting psychologically safe and healthy workplace cultures, noticing and supporting employees who may be struggling, having those conversations, as well as, I think, and this is really important, those day-to-day conversations, understanding the resources available for your own health, and then also for your loved ones as well. So building on some of those self-care themes. And then lastly, for level 3, we introduced that national standard for Canada for psychological health and safety in the workplace, which we often refer to just as the standard. And then also identifying your organization's strengths and areas for improvement in alignment with the 13 psychosocial factors of the standard. And so if this slide here is kind of all gibberish to you and you don't know anything about the standard, that is totally fine. I encourage you to look into it further. But also, again, understanding that if you work through this training program, we'll kind of guide you along the different elements of the standard. And then just lastly, as I said, there's a practical takeaway plan to help you advance your progress towards implementing the standard and identifying further resources. So again, this is getting you started. It's not the be all end all, but it's to help get you started to evaluate and activate your strategy. And these are just some screenshots here of the self-paced courses, just so you have a sense of what they look like. So as I said, there's a combination of modules, graphics, videos throughout. And now we're in a really exciting refinement phase too. So we're actually kind of going back now. We have the big picture, and we're going to do some continual improvement in these. So again, making sure it's as long as it needs to be without being any longer, taking that feedback and evaluation that we've been receiving. We're going in continually, our learning coaches are in the discussion boards, replying and asking new questions and trying to continually engage with folks. And so really encourage you again to check this out. If you have an opportunity in your workplace to share this broadly, we'd really encourage it. And even better if there is some time to be able to provide during work hours, like if this is actually considered professional development, it'll make it a little bit more accessible for people to do. At each level, when you complete it, you can also receive a certificate of completion as well. And so you can just complete level 1, you'll get your certificate. If you go through all 3, then you would get 3 certificates in the end for each of those levels. Again, recognizing they all have a different focus and a slightly different audience as well. So I've gone through quite a lot here in a short time, and I wanted to pause for a moment and just see if there's any final questions, comments in our last 5 minutes together. And I don't think I see any in the chat. Sad, has anything else come in the Q&A?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. Maybe we can hold for a moment. If there are any questions, please feel free to let us know. And while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, in a different window, feel free to pull up workmentalhealthbc.ca so you have it front and center for you after this presentation. And I do also know that there will be that evaluation form about the session as well. So don't close everything down. But if there are any questions, happy to answer them in our last couple minutes together.
Please take a moment with me to thank Erin for her excellent presentation. Very thorough, lots of good information there. And I know that this is going to be very important in the future for our sector, for those organizations that are, having real challenges around getting information on mental health. And so, I think that this is very timely. On the same token, I think some of the key themes around what the expectation is of organizations providing services within their communities and the expectation of their staff. What is acceptable? What's that threshold? And I think that's a dialogue that we're going to continue to engage with. And our role at the association will be to support the industry and understanding and defining and sharing information and learning and growing collectively together. And so, Erin, thank you so much for your excellent presentation again. And I was just going to ask David if there are any other items at all at this point.
No, I was just looking, nothing so far. We're
Excellent. And so
yep.
just a quick note, I'd like to share with you that the association will be doing presentations throughout the province. And the presentations will encompass really important information around WorkSafe BC statistics, the violence risk assessment tool that was developed recently, general best practices and resources for the sector. These are going to be sort of in-person presentations, and there are 7 of them. And September 26th, we'll be in Prince George. September 29th, we'll be in Terrace. October 4th, we'll be in Cranbrook. October 11th, we'll be in Victoria, October 13th in Nanaimo, October 18th in Kelowna, and October 21st in Vancouver. So please, would love to see you and make an opportunity to come and participate and be a part of that. That being said, I just can't thank Erin enough for her excellent presentation. Thank you. And David, Eric as well for the work in the background, and you folks for attending and taking the time to be with us today. And so if there are questions that will be made available, if you do raise them in the survey, we'll be sure to follow up on that. And so on behalf of the association, we want to thank you for being a part of this webinar. And at this time, the webinar is concluded as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sat. Thank you, David.